Hello, I'm Dr. Phil Hulbig from the Program for the Advancement of Learning at Curry College, and today we're here to talk about where does metacognition come from and Nelson's model of metacognitive consciousness. Nelson's model of metacognitive consciousness is one of those theories that really fits with Karl Popper's sort of idea of what makes a good theory. A good theory, by that standard, is a theory that has some kind of usefulness beyond just the explanation that it provides. Like, what can you do with the theory? What can you create with a theory? What can you predict with a theory now that you have it? And Nelson's model is, I think, a really good example of that. He initially presented the theory as a way of blending elements that were coming out in psychology with some historical paradox problems that were identified in philosophy. Particularly, these were Clemente's paradox, which is the paradox of how can something both be the director and the reflector, so to speak. How can something be the active component doing the thing and be the observer at the same time? Metacognition, in a way, it is the answer to that paradox. So when you are being metacognitive, you are being the actor and the observer simultaneously. The other paradox was the liar's paradox. The liar's paradox is basically, comes from an ancient Greek parable about a Cretan leader coming to Athens and telling them that all Cretans are liars. And this sort of put all the Athenians into a little bit of mental angst because, well, if all Cretans are liars and the person who has told us this is a Cretan, then isn't that a lie? And so Nelson sort of presented metacognition as kind of the solution to the liar's paradox because, well, you may never be able to adequately solve the liar's paradox from the Athenians' perspective. If you are, in fact, the Cretan or the person who's making that statement, you can look into your own consciousness metacognitively and determine if you're a liar or not. You would know. Interestingly, this manner in which Nelson broke down metacognition to try to explain what it is, where it kind of comes from, not only did it blend psychological and philosophical elements, but it also opened up the doorway for neurology and information processing to start looking at metacognitive phenomenons. This is because what Nelson did was to sort of divide consciousness into two specific modes or states. One being sort of this objective meta level that is inwardly facing, abstract, sort of looking at the situation from a third person perspective. And then there is this other style of consciousness, which is subjective. It is embodied. It is in the moment. And, these two modes of cognition, this one mode that is sort of abstract and inwardly focused, and this other mode which is embodied and sort of outwardly focused, where these two modes of consciousness interact, you end up with processes of monitoring and control, which are what metacognition actually is. Metacognition is sort of the monitoring and control of your actual thoughts and cognitive functions. And so, because of this interaction between monitoring and control that he identified, it made it possible to create experiments using modern neuroimaging techniques like fMRI to really look at areas of the brain that might be involved in metacognition. And it turns out that there actually is a very specific region that, at least in the monitoring and control aspect of metacognition, is heavily involved. And this was discovered through use of what is called a Stroop task, which is a task that generates this quality called cognitive interference. Now, cognitive interference really occurs in the brain when you have to really control your attention. and there are competing things for that attention, competing things that you need to be monitoring and staying on top of, or else you're not going to be able to complete the task. In the case of the Stroop task, how they do this is just with words that are printed in different colors. When you read a word that is a color word that is the same color as the word that's written, we have no problem with that. We do that very quickly. But if the word is written in one way and the color is different, it creates this cognitive interference as we are looking at the word that says one color and looking at the color of the word, which is a different color. And so that actually slows us down in our ability to read those words, and that can be turned into a time interval that it can actually be studied. And when we put people who are doing a Stroop task into an MRI, what we find is that we can actually isolate the areas of the brain that are involved in this monitoring function. Now, if you're not sure what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the Stroop task, there is a link down below in the comments that you can go to and try it out. So not only can we isolate the areas of the brain that are involved in this activity of monitoring, but we also can identify the fact that this ability of monitoring that we have comes with a sensation, with a feeling. And I'll get into this more later when I talk about heart and the feeling of knowing. But for this presentation, it's really just important to know, by breaking down the processes of metacognition into monitoring and control, we are able to really start identifying areas of the brain that may be responsible for metacognition, and what does that look like when these areas are damaged? What are the disabilities or the conditions that occur if a person has an anomaly in their anterior cingulate? And what we have found is that people are at higher risk for psychosis. They suffer from conditions like schizophrenia, attention deficit disorder, and obsessive compulsive disorder. And so, if a deformed anterior cingulate, or in the case of this study right here, a paracingulate sucleus, if there are deformations and they lead to correlations with different weaknesses, because there actually have been a few studies that point to positive associations between the ACC and traits like resilience, coping strategies, and really knowing how to facilitate adaptation in stressful situations. This is kind of a significant feature that has also been seen in other areas of the brain, like the hippocampus, for example, which was found to be related to memory. For example, they had people memorize all of the streets in London, and after doing such a task, what they found is the person's hippocampal areas were larger, primarily because of all of the extra work and effort that they have been kind of putting into that. It looks like it could also be true with the anterior cingulate, that the more well-formed an anterior cingulate is, the better your ability to adapt, cope, and use properties of metacognition. And so that there might be really some benefit in sort of training some of these things, activities like we see in the Stroop task. Because what we know from studying neuroplasticity is that practicing these elements will improve your ability to monitor and control yourself in the future. It also insinuates that there could be practices that could be very neurotherapeutic and healing to people who suffer from conditions that might arise from damage or malformation in the anterior cingulate. So the answer to what metacognition is suggests that metacognition is something that can be learned, something that can be improved and developed, and in that process can promote neurogenesis, physical and psychological well-being.